Well, good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Age of Creativity Festival 2022. Our event today is a research event, and it's entitled Placemaking or Making Place. My name is David Amigoni. I'm director of the Keele Institute for Social Inclusion, and I'm also a researcher who works on aging. And I'm really delighted to be able to chair this event today, which is brought to us by the Age of Creativity. And I think we'd want to begin by thanking Farrell Renodum for all her work on this event. So just a few words by way of an overview, and then I'll introduce very briefly the speakers that are going to be sharing their insights with us this morning. And I'll also say a few words about housekeeping. So placemaking is not a new concept, but as both a process and a philosophy, it's been adopted by multiple sectors, policymakers and investors in different ways, collecting multiple nuanced and sometimes contradictory meanings, whether contextualized in concepts of heritage, visitor economy, urban planning, public art, regeneration, social welfare, community activism, tourism, cooperation, or other public policy drivers. In all our presentations this morning, we will see aspects of those dimensions of the role of placemaking. The role of place-based leadership and management has become more prevalent in recent years, and as the levelling up agenda is rolled out across the country within the landscape of COVID-19 recovery and a widening of inequalities in communities, this promise of community-led power sharing is a really attractive one. Now, within that kind of general sense of attractiveness, we want this morning to pose two really central and important questions which we feel haven't had sufficient attention paid to them. First of all, where does the role of creativity and culture figure in placemaking? And secondly, and probably this is the more neglected of the two concerns, what's the role of older people and later life creativity? How does that fit into the agendas of placemaking? How do we collectively define those key terms that circulate around placemaking? Assets, vibrancy, and value. The theorist of culture, Raymond Williams, had a kind of notion that generations were vitally important to the development of culture, and he had a sense that keywords were understood differently between and across different generations. And so this idea of assets, value, and vibrancy are, we might say, the kind of keywords of our day as we think about culture, aging, creativity, and placemaking, and how these contribute to what might be described as the democratization of culture. So to help us in thinking through these concepts this morning, we're really delighted to welcome Professor Carola Boehm, Professor of Arts and Higher Education at Staffordshire University, Professor Rose Gilroy, Professor of Aging, Planning and Policy, Chair of Future Homes Alliance, School of Architecture and Planning and Landscape, and also the Chair of the Age-Friendly City Newcastle Advisory Group. Stephen Millington, who is Director, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Place Management and Reader in Place Management at Manchester Metropolitan University. Jason Jones Hall, who is Director of Development at 51012, a social enterprise and community interest company that has worked closely with a whole range of development projects involving creativity. And Neil Johnson, engagement and project lead at Liverpool City Region, although Neil will today be talking very much about a kind of grassroots local initiative that he has helped to grow in his own locality. The presenters will say more about themselves and their work, of course, as they present to us. They'll all have 10 minutes in which to present. After the presentations at 12:05, we'll have a short comfort break for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a panel discussion chaired by me, and we'll end at 12:30. Just a few words about housekeeping. That each of the speakers, as I say, will give a brief description of themselves. Automatic subtitles are available by personally selecting them. If you've any questions or would like speakers to speak more slowly, then please, if you can advise us of that in the chat. We are recording this so that we want to share it nationally and internationally through our networks. So please do not turn on your camera unless you're asked to do so. All of the presentations will be shared after the event, and pose your questions in the chat or leave reflections for us to respond in the discussion. So we're really delighted to begin this event. It was brought to us collectively by the Age of Creativity, Keele University, and Staffordshire University. And in that context, I'm going to invite our first speaker, Professor Carola Boehm, with whom I work very closely in North Staffordshire, because we're both co-chairs of the Cultural Compact Stoke Creates. Over to you, Carola.
Oh, thank you so much. And I'm known to actually speak quite fast, so please do let me know if I do speak a bit fast. I'm gonna spend exactly 10 minutes just in terms of, I guess, for you to get to know me a bit, and also the places that I roam and why I think they're creative, and how we push that actually forward. So I'm going to talk also about a concept that some of you will be aware of, Culture 3.0, because I think it's a crucial concept to allow us to understand how some places are more creative than others, and of course the typical question of so what, and then we're going to leave discussion of course for later. But just first of all, a few words about me. Two things about me and also the places that I roam. So you see me here, the exhausted digital avatar after I rode on an indoor rower. So this is one aspect of me that I do like my digital stuff. And of course, I'm an academic. So those are the places that I roam, and I just have to do that plug that later this year will come out a book about arts and academia, because of course arts is such a fabulous thing, creativity is such a fabulous thing to make big institutions much more permeable, and that book is all about that. And that also helps other institutions to connect, and that's of course what we're talking about here, where we use this power of creative connectivity to actually create a place, an identity for a location, or an identity for a community. So as I mentioned, I love my creative tech, so that will go through those kinds of slides, but also that technology can get a sense of place, and that's also the places that I roam. I roam in the physical world, I roam in the virtual world, and those would be also places in which creativity happens and placemaking happens. So at the beginning of thinking about what I wanted to present, I came back to a project that I did some years ago. That's what we do as academics. We ask a question of, why is it that I like some cities better than others? Why do I feel they're more creative? And of course, I put together a funding bid. I went to two cities, Aarhus in Denmark and Turku in Finland. But on the side of it, I did something which I'm going to just present really, really shortly. I did what I call creativity walks. And it was quite simple. It was from the place where I stayed, walk for 30 minutes to work, and notice any kind of cultural engagement that I had on that way to work. And I documented it actually on a Twitter thread, which is still available actually. And I should actually say this was pre-COVID, but for instance, I looked in the windows, and this was in Finland, of course. The movements feature quite heavily in Finland, and I looked at what kind of stuff they had. That's a kind of cultural engagement. I enjoy it. There's an aesthetic pleasure in relation to that. I walked further and saw the infrastructure that was there that connected these cultural places, where I could go from one sort of creativity place to another creativity place or cultural place. I looked, of course, of the more classic sense of what we believe public art is, the sculptures. And again, Turku has lovely sculptures all across its heritage-rich spaces, actually. So heritage comes in there as well. And I love the little sculpture on the right, the very tiny one, which was school kids creating these little sculptures that are interspersed on that walk alongside the river. And so this walk allowed me to understand how I culturally engage in just a 30-minute walk, and it was a pre-formed walk. I didn't seek out these little interventions. I actually just walked and looked at what I saw. So, of course, the background is to that I want more of it. I want it everywhere. I want it in my places that I am. So how do we get there? How do we can create a place that is live and vibrant with arts and culture, because we know it does us good. And this is where Culture 3.0 comes in. And for those who don't know, I'll just go through it really, really short. For those who do, I do apologize, because this will be an old concept. It's not a concept by me. It's a concept by Luigi Sacco, who is a cultural professor from Italy. And he basically looks at this phenomenon of how we in our societies and as humans culturally engage. And he's got a conceptual framework where he says there are three main different types of us culturally engaging. And yes, you could see them on a history slant, but it's slightly more complicated. So Culture 1.0, if you think about patronage, Culture 2.0, copyright, Culture 3.0, co-creation. So just in a nutshell, so of course, the Culture 1.0, we know this kind of type of cultural engaging. It is very much, I hope this is the right slide, because my presenter mode gives me the wrong slide for some reason. Oops, I'm just going to go back. Maybe there's a time element there. But it has limited limited audiences. Of course, it has gatekeepers in there. But we should actually think of this type of cultural engagement not as an historic thing that happened somewhere in the past. If we take the BBC proms, you can see that a public patronizes these kinds of cultural engagements. So these things overlap. They're here in the present. We have in our contemporary society ways of culturally engaging that conform more to 1.0 as well as 2.0. 2.0 is where technological innovation, of course, supports mass production. We know this notion, this concept of unlimited reproducibility. And of course, if we think of the music industry in the UK and the film industry in the US, that's very typical of Culture 2.0. And again, it has very large audiences. And it produces value. So whereas Culture 1.0 sort of absorbs value, so the money to put on a concert in Culture 1.0 types of engagement has to be done somewhere else, has to be made somewhere else. Whereas Culture 2.0, it makes money. And of course, one of the key things is that Sacco suggests that Europe is hung up on Culture 1.0. I have suggested that the UK is hung up on 2.0, and I think that's holding us back. And we'll go into that, why it's holding us back in a minute. So Culture 3.0 is, of course, coming strong. And we see quite a lot of movements in terms of Culture 3.0, which basically the main tenet is that it's co-creative. You still have these ubiquitously available production tools, mass distribution of content without mediators, open platforms. So suddenly we see this blurring of who's the producer and who's the consumer. So for instance, I have here on the left the Lost Carnival, Wild Rumpus in 2017 in our region here, which was a 3-day festival, but there was a storyline alongside these 3 days. And anyone who stayed there, the audience, quotation mark, were woven into the storyline. So it's not quite clear anymore who makes the story, or who is part of the story, or who's the author. So who's the artist, who's the audience, who's the producer, who's the consumer. When does the artwork start? When does it stop? These are all suddenly much more difficult to consider. And of course, there are sort of other concepts like everyday creativity, participatory arts that are sort of aligning to it. And we see that that's coming quite strong. On the bottom right, for instance, we see Destiny, which is a sort of online collaborative massive game with a lot of participation. And again, it's, we realize that how we engage in these, or how young people engage also in these kinds of cultural things that are there is different from a Culture 1.0. Here there's a lot of production that is going on. People are doing posters, people are doing dances and putting videos, and that creates also a value. So there's value creation, but again, it's not very clear who's the producer, who's the consumer. So we have this blurring of active and passive participation. We have these open communities of practice and networked organization. But I should actually also say that it doesn't have to be technologically supported. So my favorite picture there is this woolen-clad piano in a Belgium airport. Now, from a Culture 1.0 perspective, you would ask, well, is this art? Should that be funded by an arts council anywhere? But the nice thing is that in a sort of Culture 3.0 conceptualization, I can say, well, it's Culture 3.0. I engage with that piano. I sit down, I play with it. I listen to somebody else play with it. I love the idea of rubbing my hands over the woolen-clad fabric. And it gives me the impact of well-being that art and culture actually does. So that's, of course, important because I'm sort of suggesting, as Sacco is suggesting, that we have to have more balance. So until quite recently, predominantly in Europe, we were funding with public money Culture 1.0. I also, as I mentioned, UK is hung up on Culture 2.0. So if you look at the industry strategy published in 2018, the governmental creative industry strategy is full of Culture 2.0. It's still building the next Hollywood in London or Manchester. And yes, there's a lot of money to be made, but it forgets also that the world is moving on and how we engage in arts and culture is going towards adding this different kind of engagement like Culture 3.0. And I should also say Culture 2.0 has had also its issues because we know that there have been in the past until quite recently youth rock bands who couldn't find any funding. So there are sort of these things that are hooked up to typical way of engaging culturally that don't benefit from funding. And of course, what I'm saying is that we do need all three, but we do need Culture 3.0 because, and this comes to the so what, because of course, on the one hand, we know, all of us in this room know that art pays large dividends, and I'm just going to give hand these quotes: sustained strategic approach to cultural investment pays big dividends in all of our lives. So I don't have to go into it. There's a lot of evidence how arts and cultural engagement creates, not just the feel-good factor, but even economic benefits in place shaping and enterprise and reputation. But why Culture 3.0 is because it has less gatekeepers. And with less gatekeepers, you get much more diversity. And of course, we realize we do want to work in arts and diversity much more than we have before. It's also much more scalable. So it is about this living creatively. And with that comes a high place-making potential. It increases the connectivity to places and communities. And with all of that, the sort of Culture 3.0 way of engaging has much more potential to be more impactful. So my last slide, my question at the beginning, of course, was how creative is your place? And I'm beginning to ask always the question, wherever I go to, how Culture 3.0 is actually your place? And it has implications for policy and how we devise our environment and what we put on. So I leave it at that, and I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Carola. Obviously, we can pick up questions and so on in the second half of the session, but that gets us off to a great start in conceptualizing different models of culture in the present moment. Thank you, Carola. I'd now like to move on to Rose Gilroy. Rose, over to you. Welcome.
Right. Hi. Can everybody see that as a big picture? Yes. Fabulous. And I'm not mute. Oh, wonderful. Right. Good morning, colleagues. I'm delighted to see you, albeit in the digital world. Many thanks to David and Farrell for inviting me to be part of this important event. And like them, I hope this is the beginning, not the end of a conversation. I'm presenting here with the support of my colleague, Barbara Douglas from Newcastle Elders Council. And she's on the call this morning. And together we want to situate creative placemaking with the vision of Newcastle age-friendly city. Now, come on, move. Why is my slide not moving? Thank you. All of you, I think, will be familiar with the WHO's idea of the flower presentation of the factors that together make a place age-friendly. However, the real spirit of the age-friendly movement is to be alive to the challenges of your own place. It's the significance of context, and to build on the strengths and opportunities that can be brought to bear. And the strengths that characterize Newcastle are our depths of work on place, which is housing and neighbourhood, our commitment to developing information and advice services, the recognition of the need for an innovation culture. This is supported by the presence of the National Centre for Innovation for Age, but of course innovation embraces social change as well as technology. And finally, and pertinent to today, our creativity that underpins much of our approach. And what I want to do is to present some of the projects that older people have been involved in and consider how this speaks to policy and what it adds to the experience of aging. Just a little bit about how Newcastle Elders Council and indeed how Newcastle Age Friendly City works. These are very much partnership organisations. Political support from the City Council is clearly important. So there are elected members and City Council officers who are in attendance. Members from the large voluntary sector which works on ageing issues, academic support from Newcastle and Northumbria universities, and last but certainly not least, the voice of older people, because we believe, this is a mantra first developed by the disability movement, that nothing about us without us. So older people should be at the heart of a conversation about aging and play a central role. And Newcastle Elders Council works as a conduit, if you want, between Newcastle Age Friendly City and the broader aging population. So in the time available, I want to give 3 examples. The first of these is what we call the eccentric city. This was a project from 2005 that took place during Architecture Week. Older people worked with a local architecture practice, and we drew on the inspiration provided by an exhibition of Heath Robinson drawings, which was being held locally. And you know Heath Robinson as a creator of weird and wonderful contraptions that he created to deal with some of the everyday challenges of living. Now, this presented a joyous invitation to take a humorous view of the many features of the urban environment that regularly cause problems for older people and indeed everybody else. And you can see here the issue about seats. You probably can't see the voice bubble that this woman is holding, but it says, a seat, my pension for a seat. You've also got the boredom of lying on a hospital trolley for hours. Well, can't there be ways of making that a better experience? What about the woeful design of bus stops? And finally, of course, the paucity of public lavatories in parks. So what about some Montgolfier balloon that would contain a loo, and you could pull it along like a little puppy and it would descend around you when you felt the need to go. So what was important here was that nobody had to be a great artist. People came up with the ideas, and those older persons who were more design minded and the young architects worked up those ideas together. Secondly, it was a fun event demonstrating that older people could identify problems and the measures that might be taken by architects and planners to improve quality of life. I always maintain that working with older people in this way can be a considerable source of joy and laughter, and you can still legitimately call it work. The practice staff at the architecture practice valued the opportunity of meeting face to face with the key sector of people for whom they are designing and discussing features with them that were identified as usually being overlooked or simply not working for people. And older people were pleased to show that they were capable commentators on place. The second project, Doorbells, began as a series of workshops in a typical neighbourhood of Newcastle, in which older residents spoke of how they experienced ageing in their place and the resources that supported them. These conversations were supported by academic researchers from Newcastle and Northumbria universities, an illustrator, and you can see some of Martin's work here. He drew the things that he heard, and this was a super way of keeping a record of the conversation. And in the final session, a local drama group performed a song based on what they were hearing. From this first engagement, the drama group held a week-long residency that older people attended. Some people attended every day. And together they dramatized the narratives with monologues and song. And this Doorbells of Delight drama was presented back to the group, to local policymakers, and toured as part of Skimstone Arts programme. Subsequent engagement with this group addressed the vexed question of how, should you move in later life to some other kind of housing? Would it improve your quality of life? And this drama, Doorbells Dreaming for the Future, has been used as a catalyst for conversation about older people on planning ahead. What do I need to think about? What really is out there? Theatre, of course, has often been a vehicle for addressing the issues affecting marginalised groups. And I think for older people, it is a way of valuing that ageing is a storied experience. And through their taking control of the narrative, it challenges stereotypes. And now, of course, there is an immediacy about theatrical performance that commands attention and can speak much more powerfully to issues than any report sitting in your in tray. The third project is the Future Homes Alliance. I formed this in 2016 from a group of invited stakeholders, and you can see some of those people on the slide. This included Newcastle Elders Council. And I brought these together to have a conversation about the woeful state of British housing, not least the offer to older people. At our very first meeting, we determined that we would build housing, not research housing, that this would be intergenerational, not housing for older people, and informed by sustainability and digital innovation, and that we would develop processes for the design of our housing that didn't just come out the heads of our talented architect, but actually drew in voices not heard before. So there were 17 workshops. Some of these were run by older people for older people. Some were run by older people for parents of young children. There were many, many workshops, including those involving health professionals, occupational therapists, whose voice is never heard. Their expertise is untapped. From these creative engagements, the Future Homes Alliance board, that includes 3 Elders Council members, distilled a set of person-based outcomes that drove the design of our development. This now has planning permission, and subject to a few details being finalised, we should be on site later this year, building 66 houses for rent. And drawing this together, we would put it to you that creativity is part of human existence, greatly valued by older people. Barbara was telling me that some years ago she'd gone to a neighbourhood centre and found that the offer to older people was tea dances and bowling. Well, things have improved greatly since then. A Newcastle age-friendly city builds on this to challenge thinking about the ageing experience and to ensure that older people's voice is at the heart of our thinking and decision making. Can I thank you for your attention?
Thank you so much, Rose, for that incredibly rich presentation, which I think underlined the importance of Newcastle as a civic location in which the principle of the age-friendly city is so active, and in which you've played an important role. And those were fabulous projects, I think, for underlining just what is possible. Thank you so much for your presentation. Look forward to discussing that further in the discussion afterwards. I'm now really delighted to welcome Stephen Millington from Manchester Metropolitan University. Steve will introduce himself and his work. Over to you, Steve.
I think you're on mute, Stephen.
Steve, you're on mute and you need to swap your display.
Yeah, there's lots of buttons. I'm assuming everyone can now hear and see a nice picture of some Christmas lights.
If you go to slideshow or swap display, you should get that.
Okay, let me try that again. Okay, can everyone hear me at least?
We could hear you now, Steve. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, let me try that again. I don't know what went wrong. Now does it work?
It's coming through.
Yay.
Yes.
Brilliant.
Right.
I'll just crack on then. Yeah, I'm Steve Millington. Work at Manchester Metropolitan University for the Institute of Place Management. We're a professional body helping people to make places better. So hopefully that's everyone on the call, unless you want to make them worse. I don't know. I'd rather you didn't. And in our spare time, we lead the National High Streets Task Force for England. But in this, I want to kind of go back in time a little bit to revisit some earlier research and look at its relevance today. And this picture kind of sums it up, which might seem a bit trivial in a context of levelling up, cost of living crisis and a European war. Why on earth am I talking about Christmas light displays? But I guess my perspective on that is everyday life goes on. And I want to draw attention to this work, which we put together an edited collection some time ago on rethinking the cultural economy, which drew attention to the value of community-driven and non-professional cultural practice. And the reason behind that is that creativity is deployed in all facets of policy, business development, education, social cohesion, often with the mantra, creative people embody the appropriate skills, enterprise, innovation, flexibility to compete in a fast-paced, knowledge-driven global economy. And then with the influence of Richard Florida, Charles Landry, urbanists who argued creativity was a solution to urban problems, many cities have attempted to nurture creative industries through the formation of centrally located bohemian cultural quarters to attract the elusive creative class as a way to boost their economy or brand themselves to an international audience. Now, unfortunately, Christmas lights are one of many creative practices that directly challenge the moral and discipline and imperatives of esteemed experts. For me, they're very powerful placemaking tools, enabling ordinary people to transform streets and neighborhoods in new and enchanted ways, and far from being environmental disasters, can generate multiple social and cultural outcomes, contributing to belonging, the formation of new forms of community association, and enabling interaction, in contradistinction to the negative things people might say about them. So in short, they're very important drivers of social cohesion within marginal communities, often where mainstream policy has largely failed, and at the same time, they're also fun. So our research on cultural policy has kind of extended since to encompass Blackpool. Obviously, when we asked our Christmas light displayers, where did you get your inspiration from? They went Blackpool, so we went there. But it's also part of a wider critical backlash to this instrumental deployment of creativity within urban policy. So, in other words, where our concern has been with the uncreative class, or what we might call left behind communities or areas of low cultural engagement, or however you want to define that. Ideas which are founded on the notion that certain social groups lack the necessary skills, tastes, and competencies to effectively operate within the accepted notion of what is the cultural economy. Now, specifically with Christmas lights, and this quote kind of gives the game away a little bit, we're in a context here of where home decoration, designer gardens, good taste dominate the media in lifestyle programs which advise on good design, And so excessive Christmas light displays generate considerable negative criticism, dismissed as brazen or tacky, an affront to religious values, as a source of neighborhood conflict, and even contributing to global warming. But this quote gives it away. This is really what's driving these critiques, an almost Dickensian notion of an undeserving poor, which we might see in other aspects of British culture. And it's the colourful, chaotic and excessive and animated displays which seem to attract the most criticism, treated as unacceptable public transgressions. Implicit in these critiques is an assertion of how places should be made. They should be organised to produce respectable, ordered and landscapes informed by esteemed design conventions. And so these emotional public comments that we see here, and this one's a little bit worse, it's reveal for me less about the displayers themselves, who by and large are just lovely people, and more about the people making the accusations and attempts maybe to distance themselves from those who are considered less aspirational, perhaps. And for us in this initial research, and this conflict is unequivocally grounded in efforts to reaffirm social distinction through the denigration or lowering of working class communities within a hierarchical ranking of people, places, and objects. And such comments share a fear that messy and excessive displays of Christmas lights denote messy and abject individuals, where emotional response of disgust, revulsion, fear are used to vilify, satirize, or denigrate other people. So we see this in other aspects of British culture. We see it in debates around age. We see it in debates around healthy eating. And we see it in the pages of the Daily Mail, on TV shows, and like the ultimately pernicious Jeremy Kyle show, which thankfully was taken from our screens. And it's the reason why we draw attention to class, because creative class became such a powerful idea within cultural policy. But when we begin to think about culture as the basis of social exclusion, it becomes highly problematical. The American writer Sharon Zukin, for example, accuses policymakers of urban amnesia, the tendency to write working class heritage out of regeneration strategies, especially within formal industrial cities where that working class heritage was so important. And the ongoing challenge, and it's the failure to engage working class communities within visions for cultural regeneration. And I see this in our work on high streets as well, where the same arguments are made. Oh, the problem with my high street, there's too many bookies, charity shops and chip shops. And arts and cultural regeneration, it seems to grind to a halt when it encounters the grittiness of working class life. And there's a kind of spatial dimension to this. There's a preoccupation with creativity and within privileging city centres as sites of cultural production, which is surprising given significant cultural movements in terms of music, fashion, publishing. I'm thinking things like punk largely emerged from suburban settings. So the reductive focus on metropolitan creative clusters nullifies perhaps the potential to include other everyday spaces of creativity. Now, in a contemporary context, we've talked about culture 1, culture 2, 3, 4 already, but the widening access of tools of creative practice has afforded the growth of domestic creativity through new technologies and communication networks, promoting not just new forms of creativity, but also practices emergent across a range of sites and locales. But as Anne Marcuson draws attention to, cultural policy hardly ever acknowledges the dispersed nature of creative production and performance, be it within suburban neighborhoods, small towns, rural landscapes, or community-embedded artistic spaces. So just to bring things to a close, we're not concerned or with denigrating the creative class, which is good because even Richard Florida admitted they never existed. But rather we sought to disrupt how creativity is defined and understood, to move beyond the binary division between professional and non-professional practice, and move towards a more open, fluid understanding of creativity as transitory and to recognise its non-economic and generative value. And that's what the book does. It brings together loads of examples of that. Ultimately, then, we argue that cultural policy might be a lot more powerful if it focused less on the cool and sophisticated and a lot more on the frankly abject, marginal, unsexy and non-glamorous. And that, we feel, would open up a range of possibilities for enhancing the lives of ordinary people of all ages. And that's all I'm going to say.
Steve, thank you so much for that presentation, because I think very valuably you've focused in on the question of another very specific place in Blackpool, and you've just illustrated some of the possibilities for thinking about regeneration through that space, in also encouraging us to think about the concept of class, and that is going to be so vital, I think, to what we talk about subsequently, and also you know, spatial locations, the city centre versus other locations. So excellent presentation. Thank you so much for that. I'm now really looking forward to hearing from Jason Jones-Hall, who is Director of Development at 5-10-12. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks for all of the other speakers. A, they've been really, really fascinating, and B, it's really nice segues into what we're going to talk about, particularly Stephen's last talk. So 5-12, we host and produce the Cultural Placemaking website at culturalplacemaking.com, and we also work on a number of different cultural placemaking projects, including management of the Cultural Development Fund, or CDF, Peer Learning Network, on behalf of Arts Council England and DCMS. So when local and national government talks about cultural placemaking projects, that's often in terms of cultural infrastructure and buildings. It's art galleries and art centres and theatres and creative co-working spaces and such like. And often that's focused on leisure services or economic outputs, or how cultural infrastructure supports the visitor economy. But when thinking about the question of placemaking or making place, my mind immediately jumps to how cultural organisations and practitioners, with or without a cultural venue or building, can work differently by empowering local communities to both make places and to celebrate how local places make and define them. So I'm going to share my screen now and talk you through a project we worked on recently. It's one of the Great Place Schemes projects funded by Arts Council England and Heritage Fund, called Pioneering Places, which I'm pleased to say was just announced as a finalist in the RTPI Planning Awards. This took place over 4 different places in Dover, Folkestone, Canterbury and Ramsgate, all on the southeast coast, 3 of which are, you know, very typical of kind of coastal towns with a lot of kind of social economic issues around them. And it's really looking at how you can use culture and heritage to regenerate places, but, you know, more importantly, to really how that can be driven by communities. So all of this really springs from how we define place. We define this as place equals space plus meaning, and this is quite a well-recognised kind of anthropological quote of how we define place. But where does that meaning come from? Now, for us, it comes from people, it comes from the communities. So when we think of this placemaking making place, it's really how those local communities can both make the places and celebrate how they define them. So I'm going to walk you through one aspect of one of these projects in Folkestone that shows you actually what can be done when communities really get involved and drive the project themselves. So what we're looking at here is it's a shot of a brownfield site in Folkestone, the Folkestone Gasworks site, the site of former gasworks. And this was, here it is from above. So you can see it's a pretty derelict space. The gas towers have long since gone. And this space is in quite an interesting position in that it kind of connects Folkestone railway station, Folkestone Central railway station, with the creative quarter that's been building up over the last 10-20 years in Folkestone. And obviously you can see there's a big residential area around it, but it's just been left there empty and abandoned. No one's had access to it. It's completely closed off for literally the last 20 odd years since the gas towers were taken down. And so the start of the project was really looking at this and saying, well, okay, what can we do with this? And how can we get communities involved in really finding what the space is? And the starting point for that is really to find out, well, what does the space mean to those local communities? So Creative Folkestone started out by hosting a series of memory cafes, literally on the space itself. You can see in the background here, there's kind of green sort of poles up in the top left-hand corner. That's a public sculpture artwork that was positioned on the site about 6 or 7 years ago as part of the Folkestone Triennial, really to help put a spotlight in the space and say, look, we need to do something with this. So anyway, we hosted memory cafes, invited the local community to come and really tell us, what this space means to them and what the social local history of the space was, what people remembered about the gasworks site and what it meant to them as they were growing up. So as a result of this, we collected all of the kind of the stories and the meaning that the space had in both written history, oral history, photos, archive, everything that people had and everything people remembered about this site. From that, we put an exhibition on in a venue very close to the site that really told the story of the site, dating back to its days before the gasworks and during the whole its lifespan during the gasworks site, how that helped inform the development of the entire town. And from that, we then started to talk to again, similarly in the Newcastle project, we got a team of award-winning architects involved to start thinking around actually what the space might then become. We importantly then also thought, well, okay, how do we celebrate the space and celebrate and kind of reopen it out to the people again? So as part of the Folkestone Triennial, which is it's a big arts festival, it's in fact the largest outdoor arts festival and the largest exhibition of newly commissioned works to take place in the UK. And every 3 years, around 20 odd major artists are commissioned to develop sculptures that really respond to the place and the place of Folkestone. What we're looking at here is an artwork produced by Morag Myerscough that obviously references the previous gas towers. A lot of the local community were involved in development of this of the sculpture and helped create it, painting all the signs, what have you. And you can see that the sort of text on the signs actually reflects some of the kind of words that came through from the memory workshops that we had with the local people. And here, what this also allowed us to do is have this viewing platform that literally brought people back into this space that's been closed off for 20 odd years and allow people to really appreciate the space and to start to think about what it could then become. Similarly, one of the things that came through from the Memory Cafe was a lot of memories about people who used to work in the old gasworks, and particularly around this place, which is the old social club for the employees of gasworks. And a lot of really fantastic stories came through about your fond memories of late drunken nights out and dancing that used to go on at the club. And that helped inform another one of the artworks that we produced on the site, again, to open up the site and really to think about actually what it could be used for in the future, or the sense of joy that people had in opening up the site, with an artist, Jacqueline Donachie, who created this giant dance floor here. The white lines you see on there are representative of all of the dance floors that exist in venues around Folkestone at present. And then there was this video installation that was created of a dance called the Slosh, which anyone from Scotland or who's familiar with this, it's a very classic sort of Scottish dance that very much kind of takes place a lot of kind of weddings and working clubs and what have you, kind of like line dancing. So it's a very formulaic sort of form of dance that's done as a group dance. And so this was playing on a loop on the video, and people were invited to come and dance along on this big platform that was created. So this is how a project that started from a kind of creative concept opens up the space and ends up in this kind of newly created artwork at the end of it. That's very much about public participation. And what happened next is really quite remarkable. As a result of this site that's been derelict for 20 odd years was purchased by folks in the Hythe District Council. They thought it kind of woke them up to actually what the space could be. And they are now looking to develop the space, still very much with the creative folks involved in it, still very much with the local community involved, having seen the benefits of doing that. And they're looking at ways to develop the space with some new housing, some public venue spaces in there as well. And again, with community engagement as this develops and moves forward, further forwards. So, I mean, really, what's at the heart of all of this is how we do kind of get the community voice back into it. And what's particularly interesting and something that I might want to pick up on and chat perhaps later on is it's particularly relevant in how the community voice can inform local plans, which really sit at the heart of long-term local development. And that's particularly interesting when you look at the older age group, because as we know, people 55 plus have definitely higher levels of engagement in developing local plans than those before. Local plans tend to ignore the role of culture and creativity. And that is really what sits at the heart of the lack of cultural engagement. Not that people aren't creative, not that they're not cultural or culturally inspired, but because the local authorities aren't. And I'll end it there.
Jason, thank you so much for that really rich presentation. And it was great to see in the chat, actually, the recognition of so many synergies between projects and across regions. So that's a really stimulating contribution. Thank you again so much. And if we move now to our final presenter for this part of the session, really delighted to welcome Neil Johnson, who, as I've said, is engagement and project lead for Liverpool City region. But Neil is going to be talking about a grassroots initiative that he has pioneered, and I think it will complement very nicely some of the things that Jason has been discussing with us. Over to you, Neil.
Thank you. Mine is a very personal story, spanning decades. So let me just get this screen shared for you. Okay, and want to share sound, yes. Okay, yeah. It's a very personal story, but before I start, I just want to highlight something of interest that is happening next month. So, come on, move on. There you go. Next month, Paul McCartney will be headlining the world famous Glastonbury Festival just a couple of days after his 80th birthday. That is extraordinary. He will be 60 years older than the Friday night headliner. And not only Paul McCartney, the following day, 77-year-old Diana Ross will be taken to the stage, to the same stage. That kind of thing has never happened before. The Rolling Stones will be bringing their latest world tour. Their average age of their key members is 77, and their tour lands in Liverpool in June as well. I think that's extraordinary. Well, my story starts in the late 70s. I think, you know, it's fair to say I grew up in the shadow of the Beatles, like everyone, growing up in the 70s. And for me, it wasn't until I stepped down the dark stairs of the Eric's Club in Liverpool that my fire, my passion was lit for music. My early heroes were, you know, the glam rock heroes of the early 70s. But when I stepped down into this club, it completely changed. And this club was opposite the Cavern Club, which had been recently demolished. It was demolished and then recreated when obviously it became a tourist attraction. Eric's was underground and under the radar. And there was people like The Clash, the Sex Pistols, The Damned, The Jam, Elvis Costello, Talking Heads, Susie and the Banshees, Blondie, Joy Division, The Cure. All the legends played there, and I missed them all because I was just a bit too young. It wasn't until 1978 when I was allowed to go to some of the Eric's matinee shows. So I was part of the next cohort with bands like the Human League and Simple Minds and Echo and the Bunnymen and Orchestral Maneuvers in the Dark. The cultural impact of the Beatles was obviously had been seismic. Everything inevitably that followed was in its shadow, but for the next generation like me, Eric's was the cultural bomb, and people, they didn't really care if they could play or not. They just had an attitude. And I just want to draw your attention to the Big in Japan there. even to a naive 15-year-old like me, they were awful. They were absolutely awful. And they supported everybody at Eric's. And, you know, we just thought they'd never get anywhere. But extraordinarily, within that band, we had on, let me get the pointer up, see if I can point something out for you. Laser pointer, there you go. Here in the corner, we had Holly Johnson, who went on to form Frankie Goes to Hollywood. We had Bill Drummond, who went on to form the KLF, who had extraordinary success in the late 80s. We had, just below that, Ian Brody, who went on to form the Lightning Seeds. And here, this lady here. This is Jane Casey, who went on to be a founder of the Cream Super Club and then the Liverpool Biennial. And then she went on to be a founder of the Baltic Triangle in Liverpool. Like very much what Jason said about a derelict part of the city centre that's been absolutely transformed into a cultural hub. And to the extent that we as a combined authority are investing 60 million in a new station there soon. So just want to draw your attention before I move on to late 70s, Sex Pistols played Eric's and a band called the Albert Dock supported them. I'll be coming back to them in a minute. But a couple of characters here, Pete Burns, the extraordinary Pete Burns. Pete Burns worked at Probe Records on Matthew Street, and he obviously went on to massive success with Dead or Alive. All these characters were in that one club at that one time. It was extraordinary. So, moving on very quickly, 35 years later, I moved to a quiet little village on the outskirts of Liverpool City region called Thornton Hough. And, you know, only a couple of hundred people live there. And I've been there a few years when I got a leaflet through the door saying, your village club needs you. And this is what we found inside. And to be honest, this picture could have been taken when it was open or when it was closed. It didn't make any difference. There was no people there. There was literally no one in there. It was dominated by snooker tables and pool tables, and there was just no interest. So my immediate thought was live music. I'd been involved in live music as a semi-professional performer. And out went the 80s chintz. A few phone calls later, a lick of paint later, and this is what we created. This is a couple of weeks ago. Chris Difford from Squeeze, he's played the club a few times. And not long previous to this, he was on tour in America with Hall & Oates, playing Madison Square Garden and a Hollywood Bowl. And, you know, we asked him like how he equated the two extremes, playing 200 people in a tiny little village, to that kind of experience. He quite clearly said one is for the money, the other one is for the love of it. And you know, I think he was very genuine. Henry Priestman was a person who supported the Sex Pistols at Eric's in his band, the Albert Dock. And he went on to have great success in the 80s with the band, the Christians. He was a songwriter for the Christians. And in his 50s, he became a solo artist, and he was addressing a lot of things about aging in his music with song titles like Grey's the New Blonde. And here on stage next to him is our good friend, Frank Dennis, who's a regular at the club and featured in the BBC TV program Rock Till They Drop recently. Frank is probably about 87 now. And prior to lockdown, he was a regular. But, you know, you'd see him in the street, frail little old man, get him up on stage, and he would literally blow everyone off that stage. He was incredible. Here are a few music students at the club. We used to do music classes prior to lockdown. And at the back, there's a gentleman, you just can't see him. I'm just grey hair there, Carl. Carl has been an integral part of Thornton Hough Village Club. He went on after those music classes to form his own band. He hosts open mic nights. He's joined various other bands, and he was a founder of a Summer Strum ukulele festival in the area. This is his other band. I love this picture. These people are all in the 60s and 70s. They are doing it because they love doing what they do. And I hope this video will show. Oh, here we go. So please excuse the quality of the video. It's, you know, I'm expressing my punk ethos here. It's really basic, but it gives you the flavor of the kind of thing that goes on at the club. And you'll see Carl with one of his bands there. Hey.
How you feel inside when you're sitting there watching? You're not thinking about age, you're just the person enjoying the music, and it takes you back, but it takes you forward as well, because there's new stuff and there's always new bands and new interests. So yeah, it's great. It does you good. They're all lovely, the people on the door. We know them now and have a chat, and the people in the bands as well. You just know them, and the audience members. We get to know the audience members, and you see them each time you come. It's lovely. It's really social. It's good for you mentally.
Right. Okay, I'm going to have to go back into that sharing screen for the last slide. It's I'm stuck on the video. Okay, never mind. Okay, to be honest, there's never been any strategy. You know, our only ambition was to create a place for like-minded music enthusiasts. Everything happened organically. And it was only when I started working in the field of Aging Better that I began to think about what we'd created at the club, who the audience were, you know, what was their situation at home, where they were coming from, what were their stories. I started to notice people who were arriving on their own, but then needing, you know, form groups between themselves, wondering what the inspiration was for a 72-year-old lady who clearly had health conditions, but would arrive on her own, thinking, you know, what had attracted her to come along. And, you know, an important part of that was really getting to know people. We did it very much through social media, responding to all the comments, but really getting to know people better. And the best thing is, you know, we've created a gloriously intergenerational mix of people from 18 to 80 plus. And the most important thing for me, it's full of life again. And obviously we know through our experience in lockdown, how quickly that can change. I'm pleased to say that it's happening all over the place, in festivals and other venues. You know, you'll see them catering for older punters, and the older punters are very much economically and culturally active. These people are buying tickets, they're staying in hotels, they're eating out at restaurants, and often it's not the kind of cultural activity you would associate with older people. I had a great picture to share with you then, but like you'll just have to imagine it. You know, things like Hard Rock Hell in Sheffield has a punk rock weekend, and that audience predominantly will be in their 60s and 70s even. It's amazing to experience. So the important message for me finally is that the passion that ignites that fire in your youth is still there. It may not be as intense, but the embers of that passion are as precious as that flame. That's all from me. Thank you. Thanks, David.
Thanks a lot, Neil. What a brilliant and inspiring way to finish. That's been an absolutely fantastic presentation. As you said, they love doing what they do. The people that you've brought together through this fabulous asset, to use one of our kind of keywords, and for all of us in universities who aspire to create impact from what we do. I can't think of any better impact quote than "I'd rather play Thornton Hough Village Club than Wembley Arena," from Henry Priestman, ex of the Christians. So pretty brilliant kind of advertisement for what you do there. Can I thank all of our speakers for keeping to time as well, and for presenting brilliant presentations. We're looking forward to the discussion following this. As Farrell has reminded you, if you can send through your questions into the chat line so that we can put particular questions to either one presenter or a range of presenters. So if we take a 5-minute break now, we'll be back at 17 minutes past, yeah?
David, it's 7 minutes past. If you got 17, you're taking 10 minutes.
Okay, sorry, 12 minutes past. Okay, welcome back, everybody. We're now going to start a bit of a discussion. And as we've stressed before, it's the kind of beginning of a conversation, an opening up that we want to explore in today's session. So just first of all, there have been a couple of questions which we want to just answer straight away, actually. And so first is, can I share the recording with my networks? The answer is absolutely yes. We do want you to share this widely. Secondly, it's a comment, and I think it's a comment that will help to kind of frame perhaps some of the points that we're going to discuss as we move into the discussion phase. Nothing about us without us. Our work is only inclusive if this starts from the beginning. So I think that's going to be really useful for us as a kind of panel to think about as we move into this the next phase of our discussion. Just before we start off, I just wanted to mention just a word about the work that I've done, because I think it intersects in many important ways with some of the themes that we've been exploring this morning. Jason talked about the importance of theatrical work in the work that he undertook in Folkestone, and my journey on this really started with Keele University's partnership with the New Vic Theatre in Newcastle under Lyme on the Ages and Stages project, which was an intergenerational project about theatre making and the place of theatre in the community. And I think that Farrell has a link on that work, which I think she can pop into the chat that you can follow up later. And this resulted in a book in 2019 that I worked on with Gordon McMullen from King's College London, Creativity in Later Life. But if we can move into now thinking a little bit about the questions that are raised by your presentations this morning. Farrell posed a question to us that I think we might try to explore now in the time that's remaining to us, because I think the question that's emerging from the discussions is, how do we create a safe, equitable space for communities to share power in place? So there's a general question there. And then we might also think a little bit about the role of older people in that. And one of the questions that's come through in the chat is, who do we mean by older people? So that might be a kind of a starting point, a way into it. So that question of who are older people, who do we think we're working with when working with people who we categorize in that way. Does anybody want to kind of kick off and offer any thoughts on that?
I'm happy to dive in if no one minds me kicking off. I suppose picking up on some of the things mentioned at the end of the talk there, there's a few thoughts for that. One is what spaces have meaning to local communities themselves, and it's not this kind of sort of top down, how do we create the space for them, but actually how do we become more aware of the spaces that matter to them, and give them or support them and empower them in the opportunity to bring them to our attention, which is very much what the Focusing Project was about. And then secondly, on local plans, I mean, there are, if you think around how power shares space, or how power kind of brings these voices into space, there are structures that exist for that. Things like the consultation process in engaging local plans, or any time now a local council is developing its new place strategy or its corporate plan, inevitably they will open that out to the local community to have their voice in actually what they should be thinking about within that. I don't think we necessarily do enough to really engage communities, and this is where I think the older generation in particular are more inclined to get engaged in these kind of strategic sort of discussions. And it really doesn't matter. To give you a quick example, and as part of the Pioneering Places project, we did some work in Ramsgate where we recognise that there's not enough reference to the role of culture within the local plan. It's very much often about housing. So actually, how do you change that narrative? And so we engaged within the mechanisms that exist to engage in the local plan, and we managed to essentially kind of insert key sections within the economic regeneration policy of the local plan that actually, yes, the local council should invest in culture, should recognise the role that it plays, not just economically, but also in social welfare and well-being and providing for communities. As a result of that, when we then came to do a planning application for a public artwork sculpture that we wanted to do in Ramsgate, when we do the planning application, we can very directly go to the council and say, look, you need to support this planning application because you know what, it's in your local plan that you're going to support arts and culture. We know it's in your local plan because we put it there. And so actually, if you can engage and motivate the communities to be that voice and to help make sure that arts and culture and the role of that is embedded within these local plans and strategies, that can have a very direct and immediate impact, and also helps inform any kind of funding bids or what have you that the council might do that can really have a massive impact on a town.
Thanks so much for that, Jason. That's really helpful. That's really helpful kind of opening up, I think, of the discussion. I was wondering, Rose, did you have anything that you wanted to contribute to this part of the discussion?
I think we're quite privileged in Newcastle in that, I mean, I've been working with the elders. I've been chair of Newcastle Age Friendly City for less than a year, but I've been a member of it for quite a while. I would describe myself as an environmental gerontologist, and indeed I'm 67, so I'm becoming my own case study, and that's one of the joys of working on age issues. But I've been working with the Elders Council in Newcastle for more than 20 years. They asked me if I would get involved in a housing project, and well, they couldn't get rid of me after that. So what they are, this is a group with a long history. It came out of Better Government for Older People, which was one of Tony Blair's initiatives. And it has a long history of activism and inclusion. So I think we are quite privileged in that this is a group of people who do their own research. They're not simply, can you help us in this? Can you take part? They do their own research, and they are used to articulating their own views and ways of bringing in older people. So we are privileged in that the city council in the plan process, etc., can draw on the expertise of a group of people who can, who know how to draw people in. So I think we're hugely privileged in that. So I think one of the issues for a place is mapping who's out there. What are the strengths? that you can rely on. As I was saying at the beginning, good placemaking is about recognizing what's fabulous about your place and what are the, you know, the issues that you've got to face. But everybody's got something in the mixing bowl that they can make something fabulous out of.
So that's a really important point I think you've raised there, Rose, because it takes us in the direction of thinking about how we promote the assets that comprise, you know, strength of place, really, and how older people can play a kind of crucial role energetically, reminding people of just what an asset they are in the creation of place. I just wondered if anybody had any kind of thoughts about that process of mapping and so on. Steve, it was very important to your project because you were kind of mapping spaces, thinking about the relations between centres and peripheries within those spaces. I just wondered if that had any kind of resonance for you.
Oh yeah, knowing where things are is really important. We know that. I do remember someone saying, "What was your sampling strategy? How did you find these houses?" And we just said we drove around Manchester at night and they were lit up. And so, but yeah, it's yeah. I mean, there's all sorts of kind of marginal, untapped space. I do a lot of work in district centres in relation to high streets, and it's where a lot of older people are. It's kind of like, and it's a really untapped resource as well. Like, you know, often, that's a bad phrase, untapped resource. Lots of people, older people, willing and want to do stuff and they don't know how to, or they get kind of sidelined because they're seen as older and in need of care, and they're not seen as active individuals, whereas they're very keen to run events, do litter picking, plant things, do incredible edible orchards and so on. There's all sorts of stuff there. I suppose did a bit of that mapping though, and I think it's still an issue, is around intergenerational contact and exchange. There's no significant mechanism to enable that to happen. There's been nice projects in Manchester over the years, but they've not been sustained. And it's a thing I always say. I always encounter. We want more younger people to come and use our high street, and then the younger people come, and then people go, "Oh no, that they're a threat." There's something gone wrong there.
So that's really, so just thinking about that point, and maybe if I could just put this to Neil, because Neil, right at the end of your presentation, you talked about the importance of you know, what you created as being in part an intergenerational space, but it is also, as you were suggesting, a space where older people can go. You know, kind of have an energetic, inspiring evening, and it can feel a safe place as well. So what's that kind of balance between a place distinctively for older people, which is safe, but equitably involving other generations as well? So an intergenerational space, you know, that seems like something you've worked very hard to resolve satisfactorily.
Yeah, we always encouraged people to bring, because I started out, as I said in the presentation, going to matinee shows when I was a kid, and that lit my, you know, the fire of my flame really. And I think it's so important to bring young people into that cultural experience as early as possible, and often it's with their parents. In our case, it was often with their grandparents as well. So it was like 3 generations of people coming along. We ran a really successful open mic, and you get like 11, 12-year-olds with guitars that were bigger than the person playing them. And, you know, they had their parents and their grandparents watching them. And it was fabulous, absolutely fabulous. And some of those kids have actually grown up and now done their own headline shows here and sold out the event. So that is, you know, a wonderful experience to go through.
Thanks very much for that, Neil. Has anybody else got any comments on that kind of, that relationship between older people, distinctive safe spaces, and the intergenerational? I'm just wondering, Carola, if your kind of models of culture have anything to add to that.
Yeah, because I was very struck by Jason's and Rose's presentation in relation to these tenets of co-creation. And it's probably fair to say that, as humanity, as societies, although we say we're now in the age of this is a co-creation turn, and everyone is saying that, but how we do that is much more harder. And our institutions are not set up to do that, because we've lived at least 400 years in an age of high individualism, where we actually valued and supported individuals taking charge or taking an identity or leading to some extent. And so co-creation was on the back burner. So it's probably fair to say that our large anchor institutions still need to learn how really to genuine co-creation, so that it's not just a community engagement or having a voice. It's a real genuine co-creation where we co-create the spaces. And that then gets connected with Stephen's and Neil's notion that place, that art happens where the places are, where the people are who engage creatively. And they are so important because they are the means of production. They are the means of allowing us to create creative engagements. And the spaces, whether they're outside or whether they're inside, they are really, really important. Again, I guess we lived through several decades where the public availability of the spaces went down and down and down. And with that, we suffered because we didn't have the means of producing cultural events as much. And that's something where we also need to attend to. So those were the two things that I thought were really striking. On the one hand, the co-creation, and on the other hand, the places, the physical places in which that co-creation can have an outlet, a creative and cultural outlet in.
That's great, thanks, Carola, and that enables me, I think, to pick up on a point that's been put into the chat by one of our participants. I'm just going to read it. It says, just another point about spaces and independent cultural organisations, and the reference there is, I think it's to Newcastle upon Tyne rather than Newcastle under Lyme that I'm more familiar with. Much of the affordable art spaces are being pulled down. The voluntary organisation I worked for, Independent Lifelong Learning, or have no permanent space because the vibrant building we have called home is being demolished to build HMRC offices. Place matters for small organisations, but often pushed out of accessible city centres. And that reminds me of one of the points that Jason made in his presentation, that a lot of placemaking is actually based around the notion of capital infrastructure. That's what generates place, and it links, I think, to Carola's point about the obsession of 2.0 with economic output. Whereas in actual fact, what we need is economic output that supports the development of social capital. And I think I'm just wondering if that's maybe a point that we've only got a couple of minutes left, if perhaps each of our contributors might just want to spend just a couple of minutes thinking about that tension, because again, I think it's a tension around placemaking. Jason, did you want to just say anything about that?
Yeah, really, really quickly. It's a really good point. I mean, there's a massive current opportunity for anyone doing any kind of Arts Council bids or Heritage Fund bids or what have you, based around the capital infrastructure that's being put in place. In that the first round of Levelling Up funds is £429 million of that has been committed to cultural projects. Now we're in the next few days going to be releasing data that we've got from DLUHC that says exactly where that's going, which local authorities is going to, and what percentage of those Levelling Up fund bids is allocated to culture. And so from that, if you know that right in your local area there's this big multi-million pound cultural infrastructure project happening, then there's an opportunity to develop bids around that for revenue activity projects that are going to help support and activate those spaces. So to me, that's something that if I was doing a funding bid right now for any sort of activity, that's where I'd be looking.
Brilliant, thank you, Jason. Does anybody, Rose, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the point raised in chat was an important one. Many of the arts cultures are, if you want, meanwhile users of buildings which have become redundant as office spaces, and they're fine, they're tolerated, obviously they pay rent, etc., etc. But as soon as the opportunity comes to get exchange value on that site, then they're moved. And I think it is an issue. I mean, it's the same with environmental issues when it comes down to our economy. I'm afraid it tends to be the economy which wins. And I guess what we need to do is not just celebrate in Newcastle, huge cultural events, which obviously bring a huge amount of money to the city, but it's also that small grassroots uses which produce work, but also, are hugely important in people's quality of life and sense of self. And I think what we need to do is to push that understanding into the heart of our thinking about how do we value. Value is not just about how many pounds you generate. There are other forms of value.
Thank you very much, Rose. I'm just going to invite Steve and Neil to reflect. Steve?
Well, it's that classic debate, the cost of everything, the value of nothing. And there's a great chapter, I keep plugging the book, I wouldn't buy it, it's too expensive. But it's great chapter by Graham Evans, who talks about the history of community centres, municipal community centres, how significant they were, and there virtually none of them left. I used to be part of an active writing circle in Salford, and then the library started charging us £5 to use the space. Now, I can afford that, but if you're unemployed, you can't afford that. That's a luxury that's gone. Slowly, in a way, there's no need for most local authorities to invest in cultural strategy, because they were doing so in these everyday spaces and just allowing the communities to use those spaces for whatever reason. And I think that's a healthy place to be. The thing is, we haven't got those spaces anymore. So it is this weird paradox where we end up building multi-million-pound arts complexes, but we've shut down a network of local libraries to facilitate that. It's just madness. The only solution I've got, and it's something we're working on strongly, is that there's a lot of vacant shops out there, and now we've got some powerful tools to drive cultural and creative activity, and we should drive it into high streets to reactivate them. And that will help local business. It will help older people in the sense that they can access the services they need. They can drive some of the activity, and addresses loneliness, active travel, and all that. It just seems to be the sense of we've got all this empty space, and let's start using it proactively. And I think local authorities would be better off looking at their existing statutory powers to bring those spaces back into effective use. And now there's some additional powers to do so. I think that's a logical sense. And I totally understand some of it may be meanwhile or temporary use, but that's fine, in one sense. At least the space is being used, and there are other mechanisms to go forward. I was in Gateshead recently, and there's some really positive movements there to put arts and cultural community-based practices into vacant buildings and around the district centre, and I'd be strongly supportive of that kind of activity.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. And Neil, I'm going to give you the final, because we're slightly over time, so I'm going to invite you to give us the final, quite brief word, if possible, please.
Okay, pressure. Yeah, I just refer back to that gloriously strange creature called Jane KISI, who used to scare us on Matthew Street as kids when she'd walk the streets in a shaved head and what looked like blood pouring down her face. Jane became a leading light as a Cream Super Club, and her experiences at Eric's and Cream after they were closed down by redevelopment gave her the foresight to look to places on the edge of the city centre that's become the cultural hub in the Baltic Triangle, and she bought up areas of that land. And now you've got people like us, the City Region Combined Authority, investing tens of millions in a new station. She was the catalyst amongst others, but she had the foresight to buy things when they were cheap due to her experience.
Thank you so much for that, Neil. That's a fabulous point on which to end. I'm going to draw things to a close now by thanking all of our participants, all of our presenters who gave us fabulous points of discussion through their presentations. I also want to thank them for the Q&A that they've engaged in, because that really moves the conversation on. Can I thank you all who attended the event, put comments into the chat for everything that you've done today. As we've said, this is the beginning of a conversation, certainly not the end of it. You've given us so much to work with today. I want to thank you, and I just want to thank finally Farrell Ronalden for the amazing kind of preparatory work that she did to put this into place. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.